don't sell coins to BlackRock is basically like the solution.
Speaking of risks, I don't remember if I've heard you talk about the ETFs.
The ETFs is the worst.
Yeah.
It's absolutely the worst shit. There's nothing good about them at all.
Is there a number of coins that seriously concerns you, like locked into the ETFs? Is it 3 million coins, 5 million coins?
If the ETF already has 1 million, you need at least 2 or 3 million UTXOs worth of Bitcoin to be in the hands of that kind of person, right? So they've already got around 3 times what Michael Saylor's managed to amass. Satoshi still has around 1 million Bitcoins, and there's always the opportunity that he comes back in some scenario that contentious. But he sat out the block size wars, as far as I know, and he sat out Craig Wright. So he is very unwilling, if he's still around, to come in and say, all right, I'll save this thing.
Okay, so today I've sat down with a man who's thrown a stick of dynamite in amongst the Ordinals fans' Bitcoin mechanic. So I don't think we have to explain what Ordinals are for the people tuning in, but maybe we do need to explain how Ordinals, or JPEGs on Bitcoin, could potentially be a nation-state attack against Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I think they are. I just think if the attack, if what you're going through is essentially the same, whether it's a state attack or not, who really cares where it comes from? I think there's never I think with any sort of progressive movement like Bitcoin, half the time they're government psyops to begin with, and there's enough people out there that think that the Bitcoin was made by the NSA anyway, and that doesn't mean you don't get genuine people joining in, right? But conversely, you also have genuine movements that are authentic and start out, with genuine people, and then all the cops show up and everyone in it's an undercover, and you can't really separate the two, right? So I think it works with the same with attacks. Like it can be an organic thing that they realized is a really good way to mess up Bitcoin, or it can be something cynically derived where you now have a bunch of gullible idiots that aren't government actors buying JPEGs that are messing things up. So where does the government begin and where do like useful idiots end? I don't know, but I think they cross contaminate and it sort of becomes meaningless knowing what the origin of it is. If that makes sense as an answer.
It makes a lot of sense. Now, I'd never considered that possibility. Now, again, this is a very small possibility. I'm not saying either that JPEGs are 100%, being funded by nation states in one way, shape, or form to be an attack on Bitcoin. But I think you were the first person who put that idea in my head in a phenomenal interview you did with Preston, and it really got me thinking since then. But maybe we could kind of walk through, hypothetically, how could this be an attack on Bitcoin? Or what exactly are they doing? And how is this attacking Bitcoin?
So anything that makes difficult, annoying, or expensive to use is essentially an attack on it, right? Bitcoin attacks itself by getting too large. It becomes a victim of its own success. Like there was nothing better than Bitcoin in like 2015. It just worked absolutely perfectly. The hash rate was high enough for it not to be, something you could attack or outmine with malicious mining. And the blockchain was still like easily accessible to everyone, but we knew those days would never last. We just thought one day we're going to have to scale this thing so that billions of people can transact on it, without having to resort to third-party custodians, because then you're back to gold 2.0 and 6102s and all that. And that's one of Bitcoin's weak points, right? It's always been, how do we scale it? And the whole conversation around the block size war was always, well, something's got to give. We can either make blocks bigger and bigger and bigger to accommodate all the world's financial history on the base layer. We can do that, but then no one's going to be able to run a node. And, you're basically going to be back to having a central bank decide how much money there is and what blocks are valid and all that. That's no good. But at least everyone will temporarily have access to cheap access to the blockchain. Or you go the other way and you're like, well, I hope everyone, we'll find some other way to make it functional as a medium of exchange with scaling tech like Lightning and things like that without ruining the other part. So we sort of went down that way with the trade-offs there. So I'm endeavoring to remember why I'm even giving that context there. I'm having a Joe Biden moment. What did you even
We're
say to
talking
make me
of,
think of all that?
yeah, so we're talking about a tax on Bitcoin, and I think you said Joe Biden moment. I love that. So
Sorry.
we're talking about a tax on Bitcoin, and we're talking about how Bitcoin is an attack on itself, and there is no way
Right.
to scale Bitcoin at the base layer.
Yeah, so here's the thing. So in that circumstance, in that conversation, yeah, here's the point I was trying to make. You have the assumption always was we'll scale it because we kind of need fees to be high anyway. Block space is intentionally limited. Um, and there'll just eventually be a massive competition for block space no matter what happens. But the assumption was always that it would be amongst people using Bitcoin to actually move money around, and not that there'd be this new use case for Bitcoin's blockchain, which was storing data. Because yeah, like if you zoom out enough, it's all just data storage. But if you zoom in, there's a very specific purpose for Bitcoin's blockchain, which is just is an uncorruptible ledger of financial history. You're not supposed to piggyback on top of that in a parasitic fashion and say, well, what if we start using this ledger to draw little dicks? Like it's literally like having a log, an accountant's log, a book on your desk that you keep your financial history in, and your kids come and start drawing penises all over it. I mean, it's literally what they were doing to the ledger. And that's annoying, and it's not what the thing is for. And it has actual consequences as well. It's not just annoying and we ignore it or we find it tasteful. It's not that. It's literally that wasn't part of the conversation, and it presents an actual problem because when people start using the blockchain for extraneous use cases, that corrupts so much of the dynamic around what keeps the system coherent and makes it self reinforce. And so here's the problem it's basically manifested in is that we found out that we weren't correct in our assumption around there being a massive competition amongst people trying to transact for block space, and that will spur on the creation of L2s and L3s and all that stuff. That didn't end up being true. It ended up being there'll be a competition among a bunch of people wanting to use Bitcoin in different ways. Some of the people using it couldn't care less about the overall health of the ecosystem or don't have aligned incentives at least. So those are the people storing JPEGs, right? They don't care about the integrity of the rest of the system because they're engaged in a pump and dump. They're only here for the next 10 minutes, and it helps them if they put their JPEG on Bitcoin instead of some other shitcoin. It helps them in the short term because it's enough to trick people into thinking that somehow what they're doing with these things is going to have some permanence and might have some real staying power as opposed to your obvious run of the mill shitcoin. In reality, there isn't any difference, but that doesn't matter. In the short term, it's enough to create some disruption. And from a Bitcoin user's perspective, we just have less and less people making actual transactions. That's all. And that's not good because we need people to use Bitcoin's blockchain for transacting. And if they're not going to do that, if they're either going to give up on it entirely or if they're just going to say, screw this, it's too expensive, I'm just going to use some third party to manage all my transactions for me and just move stuff around inside a centralized off chain database that probably has some Bitcoin in it or might not, might be running a fractional reserve intentionally or unintentionally. Like all of these things just become a concern again. And Bitcoin's hardness, it's 21 million, the reliability of 21 million is only as good as um, as it is a reflection of how much the community is in proximity to the actual base of it. Like if everyone is using this magical system with only 21 million units, but they're using it through 8 proxies that are all middlemen and all charging them a cut, 21 million doesn't mean anything in that world because there's going to be fractional reserves, there's going to be hacks and losses, and there already has been. Like if everyone just trusted Mount Gox, it would never have collapsed. It's only because people didn't trust it that they started withdrawing and then all the cracks started to show. If you're prepared to trust third parties, then they will just do what Mt. Gox did, which is say they have a bunch of Bitcoin that they don't really have, and then there's no more 21 million. There's just way more than that. And I'm sure that's already the case. So this has been the concern of big blockers. This is why they wanted big blocks, because they want everyone to use the chain directly. Because if everyone's using the chain directly, you can't make any more than 21 million. But then the rule of 21 million, the enforcers of that get degraded in another capacity because the blocks they have to store get so large that no one runs a node anymore. And when no one runs a node, you can't enforce 21 million either. So it can get degraded from either perspective. So, I mean, yeah, that's, I don't know. What are you thinking now after all that? Where do we go from here in this conversation?
You mentioned scaling. We're definitely going to come back to mining and block congestion and everything you guys are doing at Ocean, but you mentioned scaling. I'm interested. Well, how do you think Bitcoin is going to scale, and what do you think is the ideal way that Bitcoin can scale?
The ideal way is that we get this plethora of use cases. Giacomo Zucco wrote this amazing tweet a couple of days ago with the various trade off levels that come with it. So you have eCash, you have Liquid, you have Lightning. You have Lightning as a way of moving around between various federations and arcs and coin pools. And you can hop around from each one to the other. That's what's so great about Lightning, right? Is that you can move in and out of different levels, and you have on chain right at the bottom of the whole thing. I think it's not as bad as gold. Like, the better Bitcoin is as a medium of exchange, and the more easily verifiable it is, thanks to the cheapness of running a node, the harder it is for fractional reserve things to happen and for there to be fake Bitcoin out there in the world, giving us the effect of inflation that shouldn't have happened. Um, so, how do we scale? Covenants are a possible option, though I'm pretty cynical about. I don't know. Some days I'm optimistic, some days I'm cynical about it. Lightning was the first real promising thing Bitcoin ever had by way of scaling, and it's still amazing on paper, but in practice it's still just so annoying when you get down into the weeds of it, how many people actually use Lightning as a service provided to them by some third party, and these third parties that manage everyone's channels for them, and as a result offer them no privacy and charge a fortune for it. To me, they're the Google of tomorrow. They're just going to be the big data platforms of Bitcoin, and I see that creeping around already, and that's a real shame. So, um, I see that happening. I don't want it to happen. I've fought really hard for it not to happen. There are companies in the space that are trying to make it so that plebs can run Lightning nodes and actually have a good experience with it and not lose all their money. And it's been a hard uphill battle. Shout out to the people doing it, which is MyNode and Raspberry Blitz and Umbrel, and then where I used to work, Start9, which in my opinion is the best of that group. Um, Nonetheless, as hard as we might try, it's still really hard getting people to run Lightning nodes, open channels, do channel management, do proper backups, and never have anything go wrong, like get accidentally justiced or just have their server die on them and not have a good way to recover it. It's all really difficult. Um, and that's pretty much the best we have for scaling. The next thing is Liquid. I really like Liquid. It's one of these things that on paper and ideologically everyone just hates and laughs at, but in practice is actually really good and really solid. So, Francis Pulio, ever the pragmatist in Bitcoin, just like Satoshi himself, he found it to be a really good solution, actually. So you run a Bitcoin exchange, people want to stack on it, they want to do DCAing, but if you're buying $50 worth of Bitcoin a week, that's terrible UTXO management, or it means leaving your DCA in an exchange for months until you get enough to justify making a UTXO. That's no good either, because then you have to trust an exchange for ages. So next best thing is to trust a federation like Liquid. So this was the genius model of what Bull Bitcoin laid out. And I promise I'm not, I actually am affiliated with them, but I've earned like $10 ever. I'm just celebrating this because I really think it's a good approach. You DCA into Liquid and get LBTC instead of Bitcoin. And you do that because the transaction fees are really cheap there. It's pretty difficult to get rugged. And you can do it to you can do it to hundreds of dollars, maybe $1,000. Then once you've done that, you can move via Lightning into a Lightning channel or just straight up go into on chain Bitcoin. And you can do that periodically when you have enough to justify making a whole UTXO out of it. And I think your chances of getting rugged are low, and you're walking up the ladder of sovereignty, right? You get higher and higher on it for greater and greater amounts. That to me is good. Liquid's pretty transparent. It's got an 11 and 15 multi-sig. The chances of the whole thing getting rugged is very, very unlikely. But again, like Lightning, it's for smaller amounts. The bigger the amount, the more justified you are in having an on-chain footprint for the additional security it offers. Like it's you if you have Bitcoin on chain on L1, that's it. Like unless there's a 51% attack to reorg the chain and undo the transaction where you got your money, that money is never going anywhere. It just isn't. Like someone has to physically rob you for that to be the case, or you have to lose your keys, right? But there is no better security in imaginable than base layer Bitcoin. It's literally just as close to perfection as we can get. So you just walk down the ladder from there. Like, all right, I'll use Lightning. All right, I'll use Liquid. And then if pools become a thing, or coin pools, sorry, great. But again, this is like where I'll go back to my more cynical perspective on it. Lightning, as I said, as good as it is, has been really disappointing because it's just so difficult for so many people to use. You really do need to run a server. Like with Bitcoin, you could just generate a Bitcoin address. Someone can send you Bitcoin. You can go on a public block explorer, see that you've got it, trust it basically, even if you don't run a node. And even if you ran a node to verify it, you can turn that node off. That node can just run on your laptop once every now and again when you need it. And that's the end of it. You don't actually need to run a server to do that. You can just do that on your laptop. The minute you say you got to run a server, you've just lost 99% of the planet because no one has run a server before. So to run Lightning, you actually need a server because you need to be online all the time to check if your counterparty is doing something funny and trying to steal your money. So getting plebs to run servers has been unbelievable. And yeah, again, shout out to people like Umbrel and Start9 that have been doing it. But we all started on Raspberry Pis, which was probably a mistake because they're so unreliable. People would spend a lot of money on their laptop and spend $75 on their server, and I'm like, but the server's more important. But never mind. um, so when it comes to Arc and things that covenants might enable, to the extent that they might require a lower degree of interactivity than Lightning. They might actually be more successful. But where we are in the timeline of Bitcoin makes me more cynical about it. Unfortunately, Lightning's been around for years now, and it has a lot of buy-in and it has a lot of mind share. Arc and other things enabled by covenants, it's so much later in the game, and we're getting the average IQ and commitment level of the people entering the space is getting lower and lower, because that's just the nature of it. Like you're never going to have as high signal to noise ratio as the start of it when it was all just genius cryptographers and cypherpunks. Like it's only going to get diluted from there. So like 10 years from now, getting your average grandma to join a coin pool and like understand timeout trees and all this stuff is not going to happen. Like that's definitely not going to happen. But I guess I'm still in favor of it all, or I would be if everyone that was promoting it didn't have a massive red flag next to their head as some sort of lame spam apologist, because fixing spam is a great scaling solution and it's not taken particularly seriously. So I'm kind of disillusioned on the social and political level with what's going on. I'll end that massive ramble there.
It was a good ramble. I enjoyed it. You mentioned spam. I think this would be a great point in the conversation to answer a concern that I had a lot. So before I really looked into ordinals, I heard lots of people with big megaphones in the space say, but ordinals are valid Bitcoin transactions. They're paying fees. It's a valid transaction. They're following the rules. What's so bad about these ordinals transactions? What do you
Yeah,
think of
well,
that?
again, it's all about pragmatism, not idealism. If
Mm,
you want to be idealistic about it, you cannot have a conversation about spam.
mm,
But this is my point, right? If your ideology doesn't match reality, your ideology is wrong. So there's something wrong with just saying there is no such thing as spam. Because move it to any other context, email or phone calls about a car's extended warranty or penis enlargement pills or any of these things that I use as examples. To someone somewhere, that is not spam. Someone put time and effort into training some guys in a call center in Calcutta to phone you all day and tell you there's a virus on your computer and you need to fix it or something. Someone actually wants that call to be possible, right? To them, it's not spam. Sure, they might have a crisis of conscience like 10 years from now and wonder why they were trying to scam old ladies. But the point is, they wanted to make that call and it abided by the rules of whatever telephony they used. If they emailed you telling you there was a Nigerian prince with $30 million, you know, they complied with the rules of the email protocol. Like that, they sent a valid email. Like if they didn't, it would never have shown up. The point is not the validity at the protocol level. The point is the usability for people trying to use that protocol. If none of your email providers, if they were all just idealistic and they said, there is no such thing as spam in email. Like, if you have the time and money to train up spammers and to spin up an email server and to play cat and mouse with Gmail and Hotmail and get ahead of all of their techniques for getting rid of spam. So, any use of the word crypto or Bitcoin will put that in spam folders. If you've made it your goal in life to get around all this stuff and get emails into people's inbox, fair enough, it's a valid email. I just find that ridiculous. If they actually turned around, if email providers turned around and said there's no such thing as spam, there's valid email and there's invalid email. If they did that, no one would use email. That's the end of it, because it would just be unusable. Same with phone calls. If your phone just rang all day because no one involved in the the universe of cell phones or any of that decided it was philosophically tenable to say there is such a thing as an abuse of a system rather than just use, then what do you go from there? You can't do anything. You can't live in a world where anything's usable. And this is my favorite thing about Satoshi, because you can't design a system to be perfect, and then if it's not perfect or it doesn't tick every ideological box, you would just abandon it. And I love it because he didn't solve the Byzantine generals problem. He just figured out a way around it. He figured out a way to say, I've found a way to solve the double spend problem. And everyone says that is an unsolvable problem. Here's the theory for why you can never solve that problem. Like, we're all separated by the speed of light, and you can never break the laws of physics in that regard. And he's like, yeah, I know, but look, hear me out. No one is going to reorg a block from 100 blocks ago because it's going to be really expensive for them to do it. So they'll just never do it. So if I send you some Bitcoin and it was 100 blocks ago, it got confirmed, guess what? The two generals both agree that that happened, and that's it. Like, that's the end of story. Yeah, I didn't solve it in practice. Sorry, I didn't solve it in theory, so the cryptographers can laugh at me all they want, but I actually made a usable system. And he was an anti-spammer. He put spam filters in all over the place, and we were continuing with that precedent. So back to the point at hand here. What is spam? Is there an objective definition of it? Aren't they just valid Bitcoin transactions? This is too naive. That's not how any other system works. If you look at the world that way, you end up with an unusable Bitcoin. That's all. And and if you do genuinely hold that position as an ideologue, I think you're being dishonest with yourself, and you need to really ask, how come I'm able to have any other communication in my life? How come I'm able to actually have a usable phone, usable text? How annoying is Telegram versus Signal because of all the spam bots? I lost a friend of mine lost 45 grand a couple of days ago because of a Telegram spam thing. And they don't take spam as seriously on there. They make you jump through a couple of hoops. But no one is going to sit there and tell you, yeah, that guy who managed to scam 45 grand out of someone on Telegram was a valid user of Telegram. That's a stupid argument, because they're ruining a system that's helpful for a lot of people. And they should take as much effort as they can. And if they've got any sense, they're doing their best, and it's just not good enough, right? So it's the same with Bitcoin. Bitcoin has always had a strong anti arbitrary data position, or strong endeavors to try and disincentivize that. And it led to the creation of op return, which was an attempt at sandboxing it to get it to be the least harmful it could be to the system, which is, first off, an acknowledgement that there is a harmful way to use Bitcoin. There is a way to degrade the overall system. And second off, a pragmatic approach again, saying, let's try and extend an olive branch to these assholes and say, you can use this. If you really have to, use this, okay? Because at least it won't bloat the UTXO set, which is one of the most harmful things spam does. And and we have some default policies around how large it can be. We don't care how large your coin join is. We do care how large your op return is. And that was standardness policy. It was spam filtration. It was never about consensus level. So if you have a 90 byte op return, going slightly into the weeds here, if you have a 90 byte op return, you don't see any of them in any blocks. because it was outside standardness policy. Even though it would be a valid Bitcoin transaction, you would never see it because of the spam filtration on the network that's been around forever. So Taproot comes along, SegWit comes along, and makes it possible to ignore the variable which set the size of what people would use in op returns by not even using op return, by using something else, which was far worse. And I've used this as like, I've used the analogy of us having cat flaps with a very specific size to let in things that aren't human, but things of us that we're okay with. And then someone knocks an elephant-sized hole in the side of your living room, and you're saying, "Guys, forget about the cat flap. No one's using it anymore. There's a massive elephant-sized hole, and the house is full of animals and lions now. We need to get these out of here." And they're saying, "What do you mean? It's all valid entry." And we're saying, "No, it doesn't work like that. Like, why do we have the cat flap?" And we're still arguing about the size of the cat flap. I've used that argument on a bunch of these um, rips that I've done. So just to round it all off, just calling them valid Bitcoin transactions is stupid. It's as stupid as getting T-boned at a junction or an intersection, and then just saying, "Oh, I shouldn't do anything about it. It was valid driving. The guy pressed the accelerator. His car moved forward." It's stupid. It's a stupid point. Like, it's even like calling non-consensual sex, it's even like referring to that as valid sex or something. It's really stupid. It's
Mm,
non-consensual.
mm,
You're trying to work with the intentions and the practical intentions of the users of a system. You're trying to make it work the way they need it to work. You're not trying to let attackers, self-declared attackers, undermine it, make it more difficult and more expensive for them, because ultimately that damages the whole thing. It just becomes a graveyard. Like,
mm,
Bitcoin can die if its blockchain just turns into a bunch of crap that no one has any interest in storing, and anyone that might have been motivated to use it for its intended purpose is priced out and starts using third parties instead that also don't care about what's stored in the chain because they have an internal ledger with a bunch of fake Bitcoin on it. You can
mm,
bring Bitcoin down pretty much that way. It doesn't Bitcoin only works in this game theoretical perfection if everyone only uses Bitcoin and there's no dollar, there's no monetary standard other than Bitcoin, and there are no externalities. There's no weird tax incentive for miners to not really be miners anymore, and they can reject a bunch of transactions on an OFAC compliant list because they save legal fees if they do it. Like, when you start taking these externalities into the case, Bitcoin isn't magically going to just always work. It will end up being something else. It will end up being around forever and being pretty good for a few decades, but nowhere near as good as it could have been, and a massive piece of surveillance because no one can use it in a private manner because it's too expensive, and no one can be sovereign with it. So everyone needs permission to access it. Then it just starts to look like the internet again. The
mm,
internet was free access, anyone could use it. All the cypherpunks, all hail the internet. We've created freedom. Cryptography means anyone can communicate without the state knowing who and what they are. But the reality of it just didn't work out like that, right? And it can be the same with Bitcoin. And it's a real uphill battle to make sure Bitcoin doesn't just default back into being some another surveillance nightmare, because it's not a privacy tool at all. And it's really expensive to use it that way. I digress. Maybe we should start talking about privacy.
Privacy is an interesting rabbit hole. You mentioned, how internet's being captured. It reminds me of a really, really good article that Giacomo Zucco wrote back in the day, Bitcoin and the Hopf Cycle of the Internet. If
Mm.
anyone's listening and they haven't read that, I encourage them to read it because it's a good one. But I really like the cat flap analogy. I was going to ask you about that because it's fascinating. I think it makes a lot
Mm.
of sense. So we covered that. We covered op return, which was also something else on the list I wanted to talk about. How about we pivot to Ocean and what you guys are doing over there?
So Ocean is tangentially, it's a different battle altogether.
Mm,
Mining is super centralized. It's not doing a particularly good job of pretending it isn't, but it's enough to sort of trick enough people into complacency. If, like, the fear with mining on day one of I just learned about Bitcoin and I'm here to fix it, is the 51% attack. So if there's one mining pool that is starting to mine 51% of the blocks, then okay, we're all screwed. But the mining pool is made up of individual miners that can all just leave and go to another pool, right? Crisis averted. That's been the cope for years. Like, no miner is ever going to stay on a pool that's too big. They're just going to move for the health of the network. This was what we sort of came up with, and it proved itself to be true in 2015 when when ghash.io collapsed and BTC Guild collapsed, like in 2011 or something. I don't know. I can't remember the exact date. But once upon a time, miners were just solo individual guys. They weren't publicly traded companies in North America that comply with every single regulation under the sun, and mine at a loss half the time anyway. um, Back then they were economically rational to the point where they cared about the health of the overall network, and pools were dumber, so they would accidentally get too big and then die. No one is doing things that way anymore. Bitmain are by far the biggest, but they don't look like the biggest because they're cleverer than to look like the biggest. So right now we have a bunch of sub pools that are really just a deputized ant pool. Ant pool is the second biggest pool, but if you can include the little pools that are, due to a bunch of evidence, obviously just deputized elements of the same parent company, Bitmain, it starts to look like they're above 40%, maybe even 50%. I think Mononaut's research said it was 48% of all rewards in the blockchain are going to the same pair of hands. And that was when we realized Kobo was, the custodian of all of the outputs of the blocks found by that group of pools. Brains is the most obvious example as a supposedly separate entity that is secretly really just Antmain under the hood. Antmain being my collective term for, the Bitmain controlled elements of the ecosystem. So you have Bitmain is the main manufacturer of all the closed source mining hardware out there. We found multiple backdoors in their software that they have lied about after us having caught them. No one should be asked to run closed source software on the local area network anyway, and that's just normal in the Bitcoin space. The monopoly they have is extreme. It's between 80 and 90% of all the miners in the world are manufactured by them, and they run the biggest pool as well. So if not for like some exceptions like Foundry, you would have absolutely the entire mining industry from the manufacturer of the chip all the way to the output of a block found would be under the within the jurisdiction of that one entity for the entire process. So mining's super centralized. What are we doing at Ocean? We're trying to open it all up and bring some transparency to it. Unfortunately, it's not just an ideological venture because you can also make more money that way. You're losing a lot of money by participating in that whole system. It's so lazy and bureaucratic and just an old man. I struggle to come up with the analogy, but if you cut out all the middlemen and you bring transparency back to it, there's no real room for theft anymore. Everyone is breathing down our necks all the time. Every single decision Ocean makes is absolutely ripped to pieces or celebrated, but it's not ignored. And we are 0.1% of the network hash rate. And there was that poll when I ran into you in Prague. Someone did a poll that day asking, members of the public, what can you name a Bitcoin mining pool? And we got 48% of the vote or something, and we're 0.1% of the hash rate. Like everyone knows us, and we don't have that much hash rate, like as I said, but the whole point is we want miners to be paid in the blocks rather than after the blocks with some other weird miscellaneous source that can't be tracked back to the work they did.
That's a really great point, especially for those who might not have been here for the block size war, like myself. I read the book after the fact, but I didn't know about a lot of the things that you mentioned with all of the pools in 2015 and 16. It's a very interesting rabbit hole that those who weren't around in 2017 should definitely check out and read the book, The Block Size War. It definitely does add some color to what's happening today. Now, something else that's happening today is I think the beginnings of a big change in a small country, and that's El Salvador. You recently went to El Salvador. I would love your thoughts about the country.
I think it's great. I think idealists hate it, and like if I'm memeing throughout this conversation, it's trying to celebrate people that discard ideology and actually pay attention to reality. Or at least they're prepared to revise their ideology. So I see a lot of armchair critics like Alex Gladstein throwing shit at El Salvador and calling Bukele a dictator and stuff like that. And I think it's bullshit. I really do. I think he's made the lives of everyone in his country so much better in such a short space of time. Some of that's a function of just how small the country is, but it's just so it's just such a nice change to be in a country where people are happy with their politicians. That's an amazing experience because it's just so alien to anyone that's from anywhere in Europe or North America. Like all we just have is absolute parasites, a disgusting bureaucratic class just aggressively trying to make life as horrible as they possibly can for their citizens. And it's just such a nice thing to go to a country where people actually like and support the people they've elected. Like, and you're never going to get away from that. And if you are going to get away from that, it would be via the Bitcoin standard. And he's the most forward thinking guy when it comes to pushing Bitcoin on his citizenry. In fact, but I mean, it's awkward. That's where you get into the politics of it. Like a lot of people in El Salvador, especially the elite, don't like Bitcoin because Bukele's from the sort of out of the weird party that no one would ever think would win, like a libertarian candidate in the U.S. rather than the Democrats or Republicans. So just that being the case, a lot of the sort of rich people, like that was the experience, right? So like your average vendor at Bitcoin Beach actually does take Bitcoin, but your steakhouse up in the mountain doesn't. Because the people that are eating steak up in the mountains in El Salvador don't like Bukele because they have all their old relationships with the main political parties there that have been all rejected. So a lot of the teenagers there are like, "Oh, Bitcoin's gay. It's government stuff." Like, it's that sort of thing at this moment. Like, it is a bit awkward starting it from a top-down perspective, but all that is to say, yeah, I think El Salvador is a sort of hero, strength to strength kind of story, and it might upset a lot of us when we see people getting thrown into jail, running around in their underwear, terrified for their lives without apparent due process and all that stuff. Yeah, I get it, but it's an appearance thing. On a practical level, they've actually made life livable for people that live in El Salvador, and I'm sorry, that's just a worthwhile trade-off.
Mm,
Assuming that they correct course now, and they seem to be trying to do it. They're trying to rehabilitate the people that are in those prisons. They're trying to get rid of the non-violent offenders that got caught up in it. I'm sure there's a bunch of people in jail in El Salvador that don't belong there.
mm,
I'm sure it's happened, man. But at the same time, I just don't know how else you would sort a country like that out. It's been absolutely miserable for decades. Everyone knows someone that has been kidnapped or murdered or raped. Everyone has like someone in their family that had that happen to them, and overnight it all completely stopped. So, congrats to Bukele for doing what he did and for it working the way it did. Yeah, he's clearly able to make the right decisions. So yeah, like if I'm a statist simp for saying all that stuff, fair enough. I don't think any of the people that want to throw ideological complaints at them or Bukele gave a shit about the average El Salvadoran until he came around. I think
mm,
they were just ignoring the country and just being like, "Oh, I'm never going there. There's gangs everywhere." Like
mm,
that's my opinion on El Salvador. Like I wish it luck, and I think Bukele's very clever, and he did something that is uncomfortable for human rights guys in America that don't really have any coherence to their thinking at all. Yeah,
yeah.
I'll round off with that.
Well, like you've kind of said multiple times in our discussion, it's all about reality. Like you
Yeah.
can, talk about theory all day long, but where does theory get you? So I think that's a really interesting point about El Salvador. And, like you said, I haven't met anyone in the country who's really opposed to what Bukele is doing. They're like I go there now, and there's actually kids playing in the streets at night. In
Hmm.
2022, it was actually scary walking home from the grocery store at night in 2022 because it was pitch black and there was no one else around. I was looking around thinking, what's going on here? So the country's changed night and day in a couple of years. So I think it's very interesting. Do you have any? So there's been like a little bit of a discussion over the past couple of years about this idea of what a nation state might look like on a Bitcoin standard. There appears to be a few Bitcoiners who have some really interesting points about monarchies. Saifedean talks about monarchies a lot.
Yeah.
Others are kind of like Svetsky will call democracy a shitcoin, which I love. I think that's really interesting. Do you have any thoughts about whether we might see more leaders like Bukele in the future and how a Bitcoin standard might change politics?
No, not really. As I say, the main thing about Bukele is that he's in charge of a tiny country.
Mm.
I mean, the population's way under 10 million, right? Like, I think it is anyway. It's very small. Like, you can't do stuff like that. It's like that annoying thing that, like, people with the reverse ideology, like straight up socialists, will always go on about Sweden and stuff and then talk about America. And I'm like, look, Sweden's got like 20 people in it. Like, you can't compare that to trying to like nationalize the healthcare system in the US and just be like, yeah, that's going to work the same way. Like, it's so impractical. So I think for that reason alone, you could never turn around. Like, if the cartels in Mexico got like two orders of magnitude worse, and there was like a Bukele kind of leader that rose up in Mexico to fix it, he would not be able to do the same kind of thing at all, because Mexico's enormous. It's got so many more people in it. It's just you can only do that kind of transformation in a country that small. That's why it gets to have that, like, it doesn't change over the course of a generation. It changes over the course of like 3 years, and doing that is just stunning, right? So, as with regards to the Bitcoin standard on a more general level, it depends how well Bitcoin does. It really does. Like, at the moment, I'm not super optimistic about how sovereign it's going to be possible for Bitcoin usage to be for your run of the mill usage, for your average person. And as a result, that means the state is going to necessarily be more involved in what you do. This could be a net negative versus just living on cash or a gold standard. It actually could be that bad. I hope it isn't. Best case scenario, I don't know. You have smaller government, right? Ron Paul is happy. Libertarians are happy. That's best case scenario, right? Because they can't print money anymore. So you stop with all the clown world shit. Bitcoin definitely fixes clown world, because you can't. No one is going to pay for, like, lesbian dance therapy. No one is going to like pay for you to go to school and study that, or subsidize you when you're in over your head with debt for this stupid thing you never should have got in the first place. It's going to be a bit like Musk taking over Twitter and firing like everyone, and the thing carrying on working exactly as it was in the first place. It's just going to be that for like the bureaucratic parasite class. There just isn't going to be the money for them anymore on a Bitcoin standard, because you can't print it. So that's great. I think immediately Bitcoin does solve that. And I think it's, even if it's like all this miserable shit I like to talk about with centralization of mining, and, the impossibility of people having their own UTXOs and using them in a sovereign way and all that. Even if my worst fears come true, I still think Bitcoin fixes clown world. I just don't think anyone on a Bitcoin standard is going to be paying for all this clown world crap. I don't think it like fixes war, as some people say, but actually it does a pretty good job. There's a few like massive claims that people make about Bitcoin standard that are actually super accurate. One, I think, is it fixes and incentivizes proper energization, fixes electrical grids. We have loads of examples of that now, like bootstrapping nuclear facilities, and the African grids, like getting electricity to rural Africa. There's gridless out there in Africa right now, setting up Bitcoin mines all over the place to guarantee income to any, people that want to build out electrical infrastructure, and say, well, we don't want to do that because there might not be the demand. They're saying there'll be a bunch of Bitcoin miners. Do it. Then they do it, and then the local population also has electricity. It definitely fixes electricity. And I think when it comes to conflict, kinetic, hot wars, I think it fixes that too, because there's Seyfedin again will point that out. There's enough of a track record of suspensions of gold standards and reckless money printing at the beginning of wars to finance them, because people don't want to actually fight these things, and it takes a lot of money to distort things and push people to do things they don't want to do. So I think it can reduce global conflict a lot, though it obviously incentivizes it too. Like, I'm not going to invade you to get all your euros, but I might invade you to get all your bitcoins. Um, so it's not like a clean thing in one way or the other, but I still just think, yeah, Bitcoin fixes energy, it fixes clown world, and it fixes it's going to dramatically reduce conflict as well. I think it's really good in those three macro level things.
I think I'm going to take those big things at the macro level where we can fix clown world and energy. I think that'd be massive. I'm also probably a little bit. I'm very optimistic on Bitcoin, but still very open to discussing all of the ways Bitcoin can go wrong, which is why I wanted you on the channel today. So I think exploring all of these risks is something we should be keeping an eye on all the time. Speaking of risks, I don't remember if I've heard you talk about the ETFs. What are your
Oh
thoughts on
yeah,
the
that's
ETFs?
horrible. The ETFs is the worst.
Yeah.
It's absolutely the worst shit. There's nothing good about them at all, except number go up, which isn't, to be fair, number go up is an important part of how Bitcoin works, even if it's, something we say ironically, it is actually genuinely important. Like no one's going to like that's why Bcash is dead, right? Because the price is in the toilet. Like you need actually for it to be treated as a scarce thing, not just to be technically scarce. Bitcoin's scarcity comes as a result of its high price because that's what motivates us to make sure it remains scarce. That's really important. So ETFs is not your keys, not your coins. It's leaving your coin. It's just bullshit. It's just a bunch of financialization. It's fake Bitcoin. It's 6102able. I hate it. I hate everything about it. We've literally won wars based on the fact that people are in control of their own UTXOs. If you care about Bitcoin, you must control a UTXO because if there's ever a scenario where there is a fork and you need to vote with your UTXOs and dump on one side of the fork, you're going to want the hands that have all the UTXOs in the network to not be BlackRock. That's just goes without saying, right? And we're moving away from that. But fortunately, they entered late enough in the game that they barely own, like even with all the hundreds of millions and billions of dollars they've thrown at buying up a lot of Bitcoin, they still barely have any. So great. Like MicroStrategy is going to outclass a lot of them. I think collectively they might have more than that. Do you have any numbers on how many Bitcoins the ETFs actually claim to own now?
Yeah, I believe it recently ticked over 1 million.
Right. So they've already got around 3 times what Michael Saylor's managed to amass. But it's a significant amount. It's it would be rough in another SegWit 2x style scenario where we're dumping on two sides of a fork to dictate what Bitcoin is. I don't like the fact that 1 million Bitcoins are owned by a bunch of assholes that represent the system that gave us the very circumstances out of which Bitcoin was born, which was the global financial crisis. That was literally the context for Bitcoin's creation, right? And I'm not saying it was Satoshi's motivation, but it was definitely a perfect moment in time for us to all go, we need money and we need to play an unriggable game. We need an unriggable economy with no bailouts, and we're going to need unriggable money for that. So that's what we had. And it was the perfect time for us to all realize we needed it. And the people that were the beneficiaries of all that rigging are the people that run the ETFs. So no thanks. I don't really want them. I don't want the fox in charge of the hen house again.
I think that's a great way to put it. The fox in charge of the hen house. Is there a number of coins that seriously concerns you, like locked into the ETFs? Is it 3 million coins, 5 million coins? How does the math change, or where compared to where we are today?
There's no threshold.
Mhm.
I think you need for us to survive a fork war scenario where people are voting with their UTXOs. Um, you need you need a strong 70 or 80% of the UTXOs involved in it to be at the hands of willing advocates and ideologically committed to Bitcoin entities that are willing to dump the competing fork. And if the ETF already has 1 million, you need at least 2 or 3 million UTXOs worth of Bitcoin, um, or Bitcoin's worth of UTXOs to be in the hands of that kind of person, right? Satoshi still has around 1 million Bitcoins, and there's always the opportunity that he comes back in some scenario that contentious. But he sat out the block size wars, as far as I know, and he sat out Craig Wright. So he is very unwilling, if he's still around, to come in and say, "All right, I'll save this thing." Maybe in that scenario he would, if there was a contentious fork, if it was SegWit 2x all over again. But I mean, it's awkward because you need a futures market to exist and you need to trust the person that's writing the whole thing to create something that's, the way Bitfinex structured the SegWit 2x futures market literally pushed everyone to one side. The way they said in in the contract they laid out, you know, if there's some sort of discrepancy or some weirdness that happens on either side of this fork, we're going back to this version of Bitcoin, right? And all the others will just disappear as though they never existed. And the version they highlighted as the incumbent Bitcoin was the good side, my side, the side that won the fork wars, and the side I obviously agree with. That had a factor in how that whole thing went, right? So that's important. So again, if it's an institution like Bitfinex that does it next time we're in that scenario, if they're linked with the ETF, then they're going to side with whatever the ETF wants, which is just going to be, yeah, we don't care about long term. We don't care about KYC free or any of that. They're just going to want number go up and as much compliance as possible. And the cypherpunks need to fight incredibly hard to resist that. So to answer, I think you'd need 2 or 3 million Bitcoins worth of UTXOs to fight back against the ETFs having 1 million. You need to overwhelm them. It's not just, oh, we had 51% and they had 49%. No, you need to be overwhelmingly dominant in that position. It's when you'd need like Roger Ver and people like that who were on our side at the, well, long enough ago he was once on our side with hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin. You need them dumping it hard on the fork side that's trying to impose a bunch of KYC or AML or any of that crap. You need hundreds of thousands of Bitcoins being dumped in minutes, nuking that thing to zero so that everyone gives up.
That's a really good answer, really tangible answer. I've never given it that much thought before. I think the way you frame it of we need 2 to 3 million, like, you know, this is self-custodied UTXOs, which is the really important part. I think it's really difficult to get a gauge of, you know, where Bitcoin adoption is at. But I think Blockware did a good report a while ago, and they said there's somewhere around 40 million on-chain users. But if you have a look at the number of Bitcoin users on exchanges, there's like 400 million people who may or may not have bought some Bitcoin on an exchange. And like you say, the exchanges could side with the BlackRock's or the ESG fork or the proof of stake fork. So,
I mean, Mt. Gox is giving everyone some money at the moment, right? But they're also giving them their Bcash. Um, you know, they could have decided that Bcash was the real Bitcoin and never given you your Bitcoin. That's the extreme example of it, right? They could have just been big block idealists that went, oh yeah, Bitcoin, SegWit Bitcoin's nothing to do with it. Like we threw that all in the garbage or sold it, right? Because there was a bunch of other forks. What did they do with them? There was Bitcoin Gold and Bitcoin Diamond. They're not honoring any of those. They probably just sold them all. So like they can just sell your Bitcoin, the thing you think is Bitcoin, and they can say, oh, yeah, we went with the ETFs and the government and all that stuff. And we did what the SEC told us, which is this new version of Bitcoin. And we have 1 million Bitcoins worth of UTXOs on this new chain to back it up. We're putting our UTXOs where our mouth is. Can you imagine a scenario like that? Like it's very possible if you have enough Bitcoins inside those institutions. It starts to become like an inevitability at some point. So don't sell coins to BlackRock is basically like the solution.
And take self-custody of your Bitcoin. You never know when Mt. Gox is going to go bankrupt. And like, I think the same holds true today. Like a lot of people are looking at Coinbase, oh, they're safe, they're regulated. Well, everybody said the same thing about BlockFi and FTX a couple of years ago. So again, now, I wanted to quickly interrupt today's interview to give a massive shout out to our lead sponsor, Rhino Bitcoin. Rhino is a Bitcoin banking solution that combines traditional financial services with the power of Bitcoin. Created by Bitcoiners for Bitcoiners, Rhino offers a range of different services. You can buy Bitcoin, you can sell Bitcoin, you can withdraw straight to cold storage, and you can even pay other people using the Bitcoin Lightning Network. You can also purchase gift cards with sats at the click of a button, and you can even connect a multi-signature setup to Casa, all by using the Rhino application. Additionally, you can even send cash globally to your family and friends using Rhino, and soon you'll be able to pay bills, borrow money against your Bitcoin, and even save Bitcoin for your retirement, all in the one seamless application. You guys can visit rhinobitcoin.com to download Rhino today and experience the future of Bitcoin banking.
I will say that there's usually some warning when those things collapse. So BlockFi obviously had no idea what they were doing. Do you remember when they sent 750 Bitcoins to someone instead of $750? and then they asked for it back and offered this like joke amount of money to them in compensation. I don't know if they ever got it, but like they stayed around for like a year after that, and I'm like, why would you ever leave your money on a platform run by clowns like that?
Mm,
And Mt. Gox was the same. Mt. Gox was like, for a year, no one could get any fiat off there. It would take like months of hassling them, and I'm like, yeah, this thing is going to explode at any point.
mm,
And like, I withdrew anything I had on there, and it was like 8 months later, it collapsed. So I'm not saying you're right.
mm,
Definitely get your coins off exchanges, but like, I'm also saying like there are competent exchanges that probably won't run off with your money, so you're safe to send your fiat there and then buy and then withdraw. Like, but don't send your money to like incompetent people like BlockFi or Mt. Gox. Like the minute you start hearing rumors, Quadriga in Canada was the same.
mm,
There was rumors about them collapsing for months. Everyone was saying something weird's going on here, and then the guy was faked his own death, right? With this in this region of India,
mm.
where everyone's known for going to buy death certificates and all that. I don't know. I digress.
I've actually watched a really interesting documentary on the collapse of Quadriga. It's actually a pretty well done documentary as well. So that's an interesting rabbit hole. Never
Can you
trust.
share it with me? I haven't
Yeah,
seen it.
I'll
I
send it to you after the fact. It was on Netflix.
I got burnt by that. Not personally, but there were people. I'd only just moved to Canada in 2018, and I went around telling everyone Bitcoin was great, and everyone that listened to me opened accounts on Quadriga,
Oh
and
shit.
like there was one guy that was messaging me for a whole year, like, really, I'm not sure, I'm not sure, I'm not sure, and then he finally one day was like, that's it, I'm going for it. Sent a bunch of money to Quadriga, bought a bunch of Bitcoin, and like 2 days later it collapsed,
Oh
like
shit.
without him withdrawing it. And I'm like, dude, I'm so like I
Oh
couldn't
no.
believe it. Like it was the worst luck I've ever seen. Like he's because it collapsed in 2019 and I met that dude in 2018 at the beginning of the year. So it was like, dude, he had literally the worst luck I've ever come across in the whole space. Because whatever he bought would probably be worth hundreds of thousands now as well.
Mm.
Ugh, makes
Did
me
you get
sick.
him did you get him to buy after the collapse?
I don't know. I don't think we ever spoke after that. I think he was just too sick, like to
Yeah.
even like I don't blame him. I would be too. But I mean, at the end of the day, it wasn't my fault. But
Mm,
I still feel responsible for it. I never used Quadriga because I was still in the UK.
mm,
Like so, I wasn't paying attention and keeping my ear to the ground around whether it was going to collapse. And when it did, again, there were all those stories like people
mm,
saying, "Oh yeah, they were falling apart. Like no one was getting their withdrawals for ages." I didn't pay any attention. If I had been, I would have been contacting everyone I knew that I'd ever spoken to about Bitcoin in Canada and gone, "Get your money off Quadriga, it's
mm.
collapsing." But I just didn't notice. So send me that Netflix documentary if you don't mind. I'd like to see it.
100% will do. Is very well done. Now, Mechanic, we've been going for probably near an hour now. Is there anything that you think we missed today that's really important to touch on in the Bitcoin space, or anything that you think is a little bit underrated and not talked about enough?
I think we covered everything.
Mm,
I think it's a long, complicated rabbit hole, and just the learning never stops. And I think Bitcoin's here's my perspective on it. Overall, I think Bitcoin is inevitable, but it's probably going to suck in comparison to how good we thought it might be. I don't think anyone else thinks that. I think everyone else thinks it's
mm,
great and it's going to fix everything, or it's a joke and it's going to die. Those seem to be the two opinions in the world, and I don't really agree with either of them. I think it's inevitable. I think it's just everyone's going to be using third-party custodians and LSPs instead of Lightning nodes and just all this stuff, which just undermines it. So I think that's pretty much where we're at. So buy as much Bitcoin as you can and keep your expectations quite low, I would say, and then live a good life.
Sound advice, my friend. Bitcoin Mechanic, where can people find you?
Grass-fed Bitcoin on Twitter,
Yep.
and I don't know. I need to pin my Noster to my Twitter so that people start going to it. That's it. Yeah, and ocean.xyz. That's where I work, and that's the project I'm working on at the moment, trying to fix centralization in mining. And that's it. Yeah, I don't have anything else.
It's a problem that needs fixing. So thank you to you and everybody else who's doing good things at Ocean. Thank you so much for your time today as well, Mechanic.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.